In the first episode of this miniseries, we mentioned one of the most infamous cyber attacks of the Russia-Ukraine cyber conflict. Launched as the 2022 military invasion unfolded on the ground, the attack disabled the satellite network used by Ukraine's military command and control. What we did not mention is its long list of collateral effects on civilian populations. This attack succeeded in cutting off internet access to thousands of Ukrainians for up to 2 weeks, leaving them without reliable information. However, Ukrainians were not the only ones affected. Throughout Europe, tens of thousands of people suffered the same fate, experiencing internet outages in Germany, France, Hungary, Greece, Italy, and Poland. The attack also impacted the energy sector. In Germany, an energy company lost remote control of almost 6,000 wind turbines. This incident comes with at least 2 important lessons. First, cyber attacks could have tangible, real-life consequences for people. And second, their impact goes way beyond the military. They harm civilians by interfering with the availability of critical services or protection. What's wrong with that? Well, it violates law and norms. Many states have provided references on how they perceive this attack as in violation. It is also notable that attributing a cyber attack is time-consuming, technically challenging, and can pose political challenges. Providing trial-proof evidence linking an attack to its perpetrator is slow and complex, and cyber threat actors are rarely held accountable for violations of law. But the incident we described is only one example of the 2,189 cyber attacks documented by the CyberPeace Institute since the 2022 invasion, as of June 2023. On our interactive platform, our analysts document and analyze cyber incidents and assess the impact and harm they cause to people and communities. In the first episode of this miniseries, we explain who is engaging in hostilities in cyberspace. Today, we focus on what these actors do, the tools and strategies they use to fulfill their strategic objectives, and ultimately, how it harms civilians. The reality is, the Russian Federation has been targeting Ukraine in cyberspace long before the 2022 invasion. In 2013, Ukrainian citizens took the streets to protest against the decision of their president not to sign a political agreement with the European Union. On December 2nd, cyber attacks began, as it became clear protesters were not backing off. The then Ukrainian government flooded opposition websites with traffic and confiscated protesters' phones or spammed them with fake prosecution messages. In April 2014, the government of the Russian Federation illegally annexed and occupied the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. From the start of the operation, the Russian army gained control of Crimea's telecommunications infrastructure. Content filtering for internet access, including the censorship of Ukrainian news sites, has been in place ever since. In a former article about the struggle for computer network control in Ukraine, we explained that this Russification of the Ukrainian network still plays an important role in controlling the information space and spreading disinformation related to the armed conflict, notably in the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which declared their independence a few months after Crimea's annexation. In December 2015, a cyber attack compromised 3 energy distribution companies in western Ukraine, the first known successful cyber attack against a country's power grid. It caused hours of power outages for 230,000 consumers and took down the call center telephone lines of the energy companies, leaving their customers without any information. In the weeks preceding the 2022 military invasion, the pressure intensified. In mid-January, Ukraine's government websites were taken down. A month later, on February 15th, disruptive activity targeted the public sector and ministries, but also the financial sector, including Ukraine's largest bank. This ongoing conflict, stretching from 2013 to the 2022 invasion, is a reminder that cyber has been part of Russia's arsenal for quite some time. Still, the 2022 invasion marked a turning point in how Russia uses cyber means in conjunction with conventional military capabilities. On February 25th, millions of Ukrainians were fleeing to European neighbors for refuge. Ukraine's border control stations were filled with dozens of families, mainly women, children, and the elderly, who waited in cold and fear for days. The stations could barely keep up with the number of refugees, not because their computers lacked efficiency, but because they had to function without them. After a cyber attack erased the data from the system, border control officers had to resort to processing people using pen and paper, impeding these families from reaching safety more quickly. The 2022 invasion period features an unprecedented amount of attacks just like this one, targeting different sectors using wipers. A wiper is a form of malware developed to erase or permanently encrypt data on an infected system, usually with no intention of enabling the decryption or recovery of data. Different versions have been identified since the beginning of the 2022 invasion. On April 3, 2022, an alleged ransomware attack against a Russian construction company resulted in the exfiltration and deletion of more than 100 gigabytes of data. Conducted by NB65, a pro-Ukrainian threat actor with links to Anonymous, the attack targeted emails and sensitive corporate files from Gazregion, a Russian supplier actively participating in Gazprom's program of gasification of the Russian Federation. Destructive attacks provide a strategic advantage in the context of a conflict. They go hand in hand with an attempt at a rapid assault on the ground. They're very efficient at causing immediate confusion, but also have long-lasting effects on organizations if the target is unable to retrieve backups. That said, the efficiency comes with a cost. This software requires a month of preparation to be developed and pre-positioned in Ukrainian systems ahead of the attack. It makes them hard to sustain in the long run. When it became clear that the 2022 invasion would not result in rapid victory, the conflict carried out in cyberspace entered a second phase, involving the surge of disruptive attacks. The most popular type of disruption is inflicted through distributed denial of service attacks. A DDoS attack consists of flooding a network, service, or server with excessive traffic to prevent it from functioning normally. It is said to be distributed when the source of the attack is composed of several computer systems. DDoS attacks have a less direct impact than wipers, but they're more accessible, allowing more people to launch them. All you need to carry out such an attack is a cell phone and an internet connection. For example, the DDoSia project, a crowdsourcing project released by the pro-Russian hacktivist group NoName 5716, offers monetary compensation to the most active participants. Despite their usually low impact, DDoS attacks have tangible consequences for people and have been used to disrupt access to information, finances, and even humanitarian aid. A direct impact is the inaccessibility to crucial online resources in times of conflict. The most common impact observed to date of DDoS attacks is a temporary connectivity disruption to specific websites or services of certain organizations, which can impact the everyday life of the general population. For example, a DDoS attack against media outlets prevents citizens from receiving up-to-date information. This was particularly used by pro-Russian threat actors during the onset of the 2022 military invasion. On the other hand, an example of indirect effect is the psychological impact. This could result in feelings of anxiety, the loss of confidence in the government, but can also be used to advance certain narratives. For instance, Russian media have portrayed pro-Russian hacktivist collectives as patriots protecting the information space against Western aggression. Russia's information operations also target population living in a broad range of countries to try to accelerate or exacerbate feelings of war fatigue, influencing pressure on governments to either stop supporting Ukraine financially or militarily, or to persuade Ukraine to negotiate with the Russian Federation to end the war. Beyond disruption, another noticeable type of attack has to do with personal data. The reason why data destruction is seen as a target is because data has an important functional value. Most sectors, from services to supply chain and logistics, are now highly digitalized and depend on digital data to operate. But the armed conflict also reveals that data has an important strategic value. While destroying data creates inconvenience and loss of functionality, stealing personal data and weaponizing it is seen by threat actors as of immense value. From what we have observed, the two belligerent parties have adopted two different strategies when targeting digital data. Pro-Russian entities seem to be accessing data for espionage, surveillance, and intelligence purposes. Seeking strategic information via cyber means is a widespread practice in the context of a war. Pro-Ukraine collectives have heavily conducted theft or exfiltration of data in the name of hacktivism. These are called hack and leak operations. A hack and leak operation is the exfiltration of data for political or ideological purposes. The stolen data could be manipulated or presented in a way to disinform. When the data comes from institutions or organizations, it can sow distrust by demonstrating an inability to secure sensitive data and potentially places individuals at risk. To this day, 80% of hack and leak operations we have recorded have targeted the Russian Federation. We're talking about an immense volume of data. For reference, the Russian Service for Data Leakage and Breach Intelligence reported that the data of around 3/4 of Russia's citizens was leaked into the public domain throughout 2022, including 99.8 million unique email addresses and 109.7 million unique phone numbers. In March 2022, a website published by a pro-Ukraine threat actor, allegedly aligned with the Anonymous collective, enabled individuals to send text messages to randomly selected Russian citizens to inform them of the conflict in Ukraine. Within 48 hours, 2 million text messages were allegedly sent. On March 29, 2022, the SMS count allegedly reached 50 million. The operation has likely imposed psychological harm on Russian civilians. The challenge resides in how this data is to be instrumentalized in the future. Beyond email addresses and phone numbers, these leaks contain millions of pieces of personal data, which may be used to enable malicious activity and cause civilian harm, for instance through phishing campaigns or identity fraud. Besides new types of attacks, a third phase corresponds to an expansion of the conflict beyond the two belligerents and throughout Europe, as pro-Russian threat actors increasingly target organizations outside of Ukraine. Take a look at how the incidents have evolved since 2022. Clearly, our data demonstrates that neighboring countries have been increasingly targeted, and especially since the end of 2022. What's interesting is that these countries are not randomly targeted. Take the case of Lithuania. The country has been relatively spared from cyber attacks during the early month of 2022, but look at what happens in July 2022. To understand this wave of attacks, we need to consider the geopolitical context. On June 18th, Lithuania introduced a range of economic sanctions against the Russian Federation, banning the transit of certain building materials and high-tech products through Lithuanian territory by rail. In early July, Lithuania also crowdfunded 5.9 million euros over 3 days for a military drone it gave to Ukraine. Lithuania never hid its support for Ukraine, but the sanctions and the military aid are likely to explain the surge in cyber attacks. Now looking at Latvia. After the Latvian government approved additional military support to Ukraine on July 28, 2022, its parliament adopted a statement declaring Russia a state sponsor of terrorism on August 11, 2022. At that time, the CyberPeace Institute documented an increase of cyber attacks targeting Latvia. The same logic applies to most countries who align with one or the other of the belligerents. If we align the timelines, the pattern becomes clear. These announcements are often followed up by DDoS attacks on organizations in non-belligerent countries, whether they introduced sanctions against Russia, provided military support to Ukraine, or issued public statements regarding, for example, EU or NATO membership. Again, the actual victims of these retaliations are often civilians themselves, rather than the government or an elected body behind the announcement. Attribution of a cyber attack to a threat actor is important in order to determine the relevant body of law that applies for accountability for cyber attacks. States may be held accountable for actions of non-state threat actors if it is determined that they are an organ of the state, perform government functions, and act under the instruction, direction, or effective control of a state. Establishing the connection between state and non-state may be difficult to prove in the context of cyber operations. Taking a step back, each phase of the cyber conflict features different tools and strategies. But most importantly, it illustrates the various ways in which the use of cyber means in a conflict harm people and communities daily. Throughout these phases, different types of harm coexist. Physical harm to people themselves or the infrastructure on which they rely. Psychological harm in the form of anxiety or depression, immediately or in the long term. Political harm through the disruption of political processes or government services, but also the erosion of trust and confidence in the institutions, including of the state. Economic harm and financial loss, including data breach, protection, response, and recovery costs. Reputational harm, which manifests itself differently across stakeholders. At organizational level, it could be a loss of consumers. At personal level, the disruption of personal life. Cultural harm, such as the spreading of misinformation online, which can lead to real-world violence. And ecological harm, such as damage to the environment. The CyberPeace Institute calls for, first, the respect of international law, including international humanitarian law, in particular respect for the civilian population, civilian objects, and infrastructure essential for their survival. Second, the affirmation by the international community of the applicability of international humanitarian law to the use of cyber operations during armed conflict, particularly how its principles and rules apply. Third, states must determine where existing law needs to be clarified and/or adapted to the specific characteristics of cyberspace. If states see the need to develop additional rules, they must strengthen the existing protection afforded under international law. Our 2 episodes have explained who fights in cyberspace, what these actors do, how it harms people, and the legal challenges in the context of the conflict. You can now dive directly into the data that make these videos possible. Our team of threat intelligence analysts distills valuable insight on an up-to-date interactive platform that you can access via the description. Our team also provides details of law and policy related to international armed conflict. Whether you are a policymaker, a researcher, a student, or simply curious about the role played by cyber and hybrid threats in the conflict and their impact on people and communities, our platform can answer your most pressing questions. In addition, we gather recent developments in quarterly analysis reports that you can also access through the platform. Finally, if you find this content interesting, share it with your community and leave your questions or impressions below. Thanks for watching.